Well, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Today, I will be presenting Beyond the Diagnosis, introducing a functional classification model for FASD intervention and support based on our recent national survey of developmental behavioral clinicians. This work focuses on how we move from diagnosis to meaningful, actionable support across the lifespan. This work is grounded in a national survey published in the Journal of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics, examining the role of developmental and behavioral clinicians in FASD diagnosis and management. The study was designed to better understand current clinical practices, levels of preparedness, and areas where additional training may be needed within our field. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors and collaborators, Katie Lipman, Kim Burkhardt, Yasmin Wilay Sak Ditipakorn, and Denise Bota. I also want to recognize the many clinicians, researchers, and colleagues across developmental behavioral pediatrics, psychology, and community programs who have advanced the field of FASD. And very importantly, I want to acknowledge individuals with FASD and their families whose lived experiences continue to inform and guide how we think about care. Developmental behavioral clinicians, including physicians, psychologists, and advanced practice providers, are well positioned to evaluate and manage FASD, given our expertise in complex neurodevelopmental conditions and longitudinal care. At the same time, FASD is relatively common, with prevalence estimates ranging from approximately 1 to 5% in US school-age populations. Despite this, FASD remains underdiagnosed and frequently misdiagnosed. This reflects both the complexity of the condition and ongoing challenges in recognition, diagnostic consistency, and training. Given the intersection of high prevalence and clinical responsibility, we sought to better understand clinician preparedness in the diagnosis and management of FASD. Specifically, we wanted to examine how clinicians are approaching diagnosis, how prepared they feel to provide care, and where gaps in training may exist. So we conducted a national survey of members of the Society of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics, or SDBP, to assess members' needs, including current practices in evaluation and management of FASDs. This survey was designed to gather insights into the diagnostic criteria being used, clinicians' perceived levels of preparedness, and areas where additional training was needed. This was electronically distributed to a total of 913 active SDBP members, and a total of 199 members responded, representing a 22% response rate. Of these respondents, approximately half reported active involvement in the evaluation and management of FASD. So, even within a specialty well-positioned to care for these individuals, only about half of respondents are directly involved in FASD care. This highlights a potential gap in clinical capacity in the field. What we see here is significant variability in diagnostic approaches. Clinicians are using multiple frameworks, including the University of Washington 4-digit code, DSM-5 and DPAE criteria, and HOIMI guidelines, with no single dominant standard. Only about, a quarter of respondents use more than one system, while most rely on a single framework. This variability reflects the lack of a unified diagnostic approach in FASD. And this closely ties to how prepared, I think, clinicians feel in both diagnosis and management. So more than half of our workforce is actually actively requesting comprehensive diagnosis and management support. Really, only 24% felt very prepared. So this is, again, DBP clinicians who are at the forefront of understanding complex and treating complex neurodevelopmental conditions. Looking more closely at preparedness, we see that most developmental behavioral clinicians fall in the somewhat prepared category, with a smaller proportion reporting feeling very prepared. At the same time, a notable proportion report feeling very unprepared. So overall confidence in diagnosing FASD remains variable and relatively limited at the forefront of developmental and behavioral pediatric care. Again, only about a quarter report feeling very prepared. Up to this point, we've talked about variability in diagnosis and gaps in preparedness. But there is a deeper issue. Diagnosis tells us what an individual has, but it does not tell us what they need. Families, schools, clinicians, and adults with FASD are asking a different question. What supports are needed for this individual, for my child to be successful in daily life? This is where function becomes critical. In response to this gap, we developed a new functional classification model for FASD, specifically designed to translate diagnosis into day-to-day clinical care. While existing diagnostic systems are essential for determining whether an individual meets criteria for FASD, they do not consistently guide clinicians in determining the type or intensity of supports needed in everyday life. This model was developed to bridge that gap. It provides a structured, clinically practical way to translate evaluation findings into levels of support need, grounded in functional presentations. At its core, the model organized individuals into 3 levels. Levels 1, 2, and 3, based on patterns of neurobehavioral and adaptive functioning, with the goal of directly informing intervention, service planning, and real-world outcomes. So this is the functional classification model, which we will discuss in bigger font and in more detail. The model will be available later, but it's anchored in 3 domains. I hope you can see. Okay. Self-regulation, neurocognitive, and adaptive functioning. A little better. Level 1 reflects individuals with more subtle differences who may compensate or mask challenges but still require targeted supports. Level 2 includes individuals with consistent challenges across settings, particularly in self-regulation and adaptive functioning, requiring structured and coordinated supports. Level 3 represents individuals with pervasive needs, where support must be intensive and often includes safety planning and long-term coordination. Importantly, these levels are defined by functional needs in real-world settings, not diagnosis alone. The goal of this model is not to replace existing diagnostic systems. Rather, it serves as a functional overlay, a shared clinical framework that translates diagnosis into actionable support needs. It preserves clinician autonomy in choosing diagnostic systems while creating a common language across disciplines. In this way, it acts as a universal translator, linking diagnosis to real-world support across medical, behavioral, and educational settings. Ultimately, it shifts the question from which criteria does this patient meet to what level of support does this individual need to succeed. Now that we've outlined the model, the next question is, how does this apply to practice? Let's walk through this, starting with level 1. Level 1 represents individuals with more subtle or mild functional differences. These include mild differences in self-regulation, neurocognition, and adaptive functioning, such as executive function challenges, concrete thinking, and differences in social-emotional development. Importantly, individuals at this level may mask or compensate for these challenges, which make them more difficult to recognize. We do love icebergs, don't we? So at level 1, individuals may appear relatively typical on the surface. Good rote memory, superficial social skills, but they may demonstrate, adequate language. And the issue is beneath the surface. We have all this. And because these challenges are less visible, they often are misunderstood or misinterpreted, both in clinical and educational settings. So the question becomes, what supports are needed at this level? At level 1, supports are targeted and foundational. These include interventions focused on executive function and self-regulation, structured social skills coaching using concrete language and visual supports, and learning environments that emphasize structure and predictability. And then, of course, the parent education approach. It's critical, particularly in helping caregivers reframe behaviors through a neurobehavioral lens. And this is where the model becomes actionable in practice. This slide illustrates how level 1 translates into clinical decision-making. We start with a clinical snapshot, identifying the functional profile, and from there, we move to intervention planning. The goal is to move beyond simply describing the child to clearly outlining what needs to be done. This is where the functional classification model becomes a practical tool for guiding care, because even subtle differences need intentional support. So what happens when these differences are no longer subtle or no longer confined to a single setting? This brings us to level 2. Level 2 reflects individuals with significant functional challenges in self-regulation, neurocognition, and adaptive functioning. Unlike level 1, these challenges are not isolated. They are present across home, school, and community settings. We also see more prominent emotional regulation difficulties, impulsivity, and increased social vulnerability. What becomes particularly important at this level is the consistency of the challenges across environments. Difficulties in self-regulation and adaptive functioning are seen in all these settings and often break through the ability to compensate or mask, which we may not have seen in level 1. The pattern is no longer subtle, it is consistent. And as the pattern becomes more consistent, the level of support must also change. So in addition to all level 1 supports, now we need level 2 supports, which includes explicit instruction and learning and adaptive skills, caregiver interventions, which may include a Families Moving Forward program, trauma-informed therapy, like interventions for anxiety, ADHD, or trauma. And this is very important. Caregiver survival. We must extend our support to the family system in a very systematic way through respite and coordinated care to prevent caregiver burnout. This is where we move from individual supports to ecosystem supports. And this is where the model helps us translate that functional profile into a coordinated care plan. So what do? We begin with a clinical profile, significant challenges across settings, with emotional regulation and social vulnerability, and from there, intervention becomes layered and coordinated. Integrating school-based supports, caregiver intervention, and mental health care. And the goal is not just to manage symptoms, but to create consistency across environments. Because this is where fragmentation in care often occurs and where this model helps provide structure. At level 2, any inconsistency in support leads to inconsistency in outcomes. Which then leads us to level 3. And by the way, people can move from level to level depending on their stage in life and depending on supports they have. So I just want you to know that this is not static. What happens then when these challenges are not only consistent but pervasive and begin to impact safety, independence, and long-term outcomes? This brings us to level 3. Level 3 reflects individuals with severe or pervasive functional challenges across self-regulation, neurocognition, and adaptive domains. And at this level, we often see reduced insight and judgment, particularly in complex or unstructured situations, and increased vulnerability in all environments. There is also a higher likelihood of co-occurring significant mental health or substance use concerns. Importantly, these individuals are at increased risk for crises, not because of intent, but because of the interaction between neurodevelopmental differences and real-world demands. Significant challenges in self-regulation, neurocognition, and adaptive functioning across all environments, with increased social vulnerability, require permanent scaffolding. This is where support becomes essential, never optional. And at this level, our approach to care must fundamentally change. Level 3 requires a true wrap-around model of care. This includes multidisciplinary coordination, intensive care management, case management, and often 24/7 supervision or supported living environments. Interventions must also include structured behavioral stabilization and crisis planning, as well as functional communication and life skills training. And critically, transition planning becomes central, particularly around guardianship, vocational pathways, and long-term community integration. This is not episodic care. This is sustained, coordinated support. And again, this model, oh, sorry, you weren't seeing this. This is that wraparound support. This model helps us translate this functional profile into a clear, actionable plan. The clinical profile reflects pervasive challenges, limited insight, and increased vulnerability. The intervention plan is correspondingly intensive, integrating multidisciplinary wraparound services, again, secure 24/7 supervision or supported living environments, FASD-informed behavior stabilization and crisis plans, and of course, all of these other transition planning guidelines that will be helpful. The goal is stability, safety, and meaningful participation in daily life, not simply symptom management. And importantly, these levels are not isolated. They build on one another. I think I may have said this. The model is cumulative, okay? Level 2 includes level 1 supports, okay? And level 3 includes level 2 supports. As needs increase, support levels are layered, not replaced. Support builds, it does not reset. And this allows us to move from concept to practical application across systems. This matrix translates the model into real-world domains: education, behavioral health, and caregiver support. At each level, we can align functional needs with specific actionable interventions. This creates a shared language also, okay? A shared language across providers, systems, and setting, helping to reduce fragmentation in care. We are very good, or at least we are trying to be really good at identifying FASD, but diagnosis alone does not tell us what to do next. This model bridges that gap, translating diagnosis into actionable support. This model creates alignment across clinicians, systems, and families. It gives us all a shared way to understand and communicate support needs. So we move from diagnosis as a starting point to understanding function. As we know, our current systems lack interventions guidance, but the functional communication, the functional classification model bridges the gap. We are making a paradigm shift from, does this individual meet criteria, to what level of support is needed for success? This is the shift. Not just identifying a diagnosis, but defining a pathway for support. If we can move from the diagnosis to understanding what all our individuals' needs, it will be much more useful to individuals, families, and clinicians. And as clinicians, we can begin by incorporating a functional lens alongside diagnosis in our everyday practice, translating evaluations into clear support plans. We can use this shared language to improve communication across disciplines and settings. And at a systems level, this creates an opportunity to align training, services, and resources around functional needs beyond diagnostic labels. So again, adopting a functional lens, right here, use the shared language, integrate this into practice, and help this to align all our systems around supportive care for individuals and families living with FASD. So, this afternoon, I want to ask you all, where does the functional classification model for FASD lead us? And I want to tell you all, forward.